In the early 20th century, the United States was a powerhouse for industry and manufacturing. The United States was able to provide many staples that are concurrent today, such as the assembly line, which originated with the Ford Motor Company, and allowed for consistent manufacturing, which was needed due to the high demand for automobiles. This influence would grow greater after the First World War, as factories used to produce weapons would convert to industrial manufacturing. Along with the economic and technological development of the United States came a new design movement called modernism. Modernism was very broad in its scope, but there were many factors that contributed to its style. The primary philosophy of modernism was functionalism and minimalism. The movement is said to have started in Germany in the 20s, especially with the Bauhaus movement, with modernist architects such as Walter Gropius and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. The techniques adopted from the movement, however, can be traced back to the 1890s with American architect Louis Sullivan, who coined the phrase "form follows function" in his 1896 essay, The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered. Louis Sullivan would later influence another key architect in the American modernist movement. Frank Lloyd Wright may be considered one of the most influential American architects, creating such masterpieces such as Falling Water, the Innes House, and Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. But what was it about this man that has left such a colossal legacy? In 1867, Frank Lloyd Wright would be inspired at an early age growing up in the countryside of Wisconsin. His family were devout Unitarians, which would influence Frank Lloyd Wright's worldview, and his mother encouraged Frank's interest for architecture at an early age.
I was conditioned by her. The room into which I was born was hung with the wood engravings of the English cathedrals made by Timothy Cole. You remember those? So I was born into architecture.
Frank Lloyd Wright would later attend the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he would study civil engineering but would drop out to pursue his dream of becoming an architect. He moved to Chicago, where he would first work as a draftsman. He was a student of the Chicago School of Architecture and was mentored in his early career by Louis Sullivan. Frank Lloyd Wright had a profound effect on the development of modernist architecture while also providing a unique architectural identity to the United States. Frank Lloyd's design philosophy took inspiration from nature and emphasized that buildings should reflect their surrounding environments. He developed this style in the 1890s, primarily when working in Oak Park. This style will come to be known as the Prairie style. A few of the trademarks of Prairie style architecture include horizontal lines, use of natural environments, and integration into the surrounding environments, while also keeping the less is more ethos subscribed by modernist architectures, such as those developed by the Bauhaus. He would also take inspiration from Japanese art, which was a developing interest of his. His next major work would come after much personal scandal. Frank Lloyd Wright had a love affair and even fathered children with this newfound love, Mama Borthwick Cheney. After this was discovered, Frank Lloyd Wright would later move to Spring Green with his new mistress and their children, where he would design the Telesine. While much of Wright's work at this point was in more urban areas, the design of this house would be located in a more desolate area, giving Wright more freedom to use his techniques. Wright decided in his design and the construction for this house that he would use only locally sourced materials. For example, he used yellow limestone that would source from a nearby hill, and the interior walls in the house would be plastered with sienna, which would give the building a new color that would allow it to blend in with the natural surrounding environment. Frank Lloyd decided to live in this newly designed building with his family. In 1914, however, tragedy would strike Frank's life. On August 15th, while Wright was in Chicago, a servant who worked for Wright, Julian Carlton, would murder Wright's mistress and their children, and then burn down the Telesine. Despite Wright rebuilding the Telesine, he was left emotionally devastated after the loss of his family. He would never be the same again. Frank Lloyd Wright would continue working but kept a much lower profile than he had while designing in Chicago, even moving to Japan for a few years to design the new Imperium Hotel in Tokyo. He was also in massive debt, which nearly drove him into bankruptcy. He would find notoriety with the Innes House in 1942, which earned him popularity in California. Frank Lloyd Wright did not like being associated with any particular design movement, except for his own established Prairie style. Many trademarks of Frank Lloyd Wright's were influenced by modernism, especially later in his career. He would adopt a more modernistic technique in the late 1920s when designing buildings such as the Hollyhock Hotel, which served to be a balance between functionalism and form, as Frank Lloyd Wright would still hold on to his Unitarian beliefs in design and emphasis on nature. During the Great Depression, though, Frank Lloyd Wright would be considered a has-been in the world of architecture. It was in 1935 that Frank Lloyd Wright would design a house that would gain him worldwide recognition and be considered his magnum opus. Falling Water, located in southeastern Pennsylvania, was commissioned by American businessman Edgar J. Kaufman and his wife Lillian Kaufman. Their son, Edgar Kaufman Jr., was an architect and an avid fan of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, so he suggested that to get him to design the house. Falling Water took much inspiration from Japanese architecture and demonstrated his Prairie style while integrating the surrounding environment. In the interior, dark narrow passageways guide the house along to contrast with the large rooms. A large waterfall outside of the house that is unable to be seen from inside the house rins in the distance. Frank Lloyd Wright believed that this was to assure that the waterfall would continue surprising, as having it been seen from the interior of the house would make it feel too commonplace. The modernist techniques used by Falling Water are often regarded as Frank Lloyd Wright's answer to the international modernist style adopted by Mies van der Rohe. After Frank Lloyd Wright completed Falling Water, he would move on to bigger and much grander pieces of work. In 1943, Frank Lloyd Wright would begin designing the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. Of all of Frank Lloyd Wright's designs, the Guggenheim is the most in touch with modernist design principles. In the Guggenheim, functionality played a big role in the design by optimizing the space for art to be displayed. Its unusual design was also not without any influence from Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie style, as the exterior design resembled a big seashell. The Guggenheim influenced many contemporary designers to make buildings more natural but functional in urban environments. The Exchange, located on Darling Harbour in Sydney, Australia, designed by Japanese architect Kendo Kuma, would be one example of the many buildings influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's unique modernist approach to urban architecture, such as the Guggenheim. The light wooden streams that wrap around the building are symbolic of the Darling Harbour's significance in Sydney as a centre for business in the city. The building also serves as a multifunctional service in the interior, containing a library, a childcare centre, a marketplace, and a tech startup place. Frank Lloyd Wright continues to have a massive influence on architecture and design today with his unique blend of modernist techniques and Prairie designs that made him stand out not only in his time, but managed to be ahead of his time by many.